So hi everybody, welcome to our Governance Made Easy webinar today titled Negotiating Stakeholder Alignment. Today we're having a discussion with our very special guest Fiona McKenzie, Managing Director of Resolving Matters, supported as usual by the great Steven Bowman, Managing Director of Conscious Governance on the panel. My name's Sean McDonald and I shall be your moderator for the next 45 odd minutes. Firstly, thank you so much for your attendance today. We always appreciate the effort you make to be here for our live events. During the session, if you have any questions, which we hope you will do, please use the Q&A button on your toolbar rather than the chat so that we can keep a track of the questions as they're coming through. And finally, if you stay through till the end, which we hope you will do, and as is customary for our webinars, we have a special treat for you. By answering a really short 1-minute survey, you'll go into the draw to win our beautiful gift hamper worth over $400. Now, for those who don't know too much about Board Pro, we are a board software provider, sometimes called a board portal, and we serve around 32,000 users around about 29 different countries these days. And we enable organizations to prepare for and run their board meetings more efficiently and effectively with, you guessed it, clever software, with less time and deliver more impact and value for the organization. And as much as we are a board software provider, part of our wider mission is to make the fundamentals of governance free and easy to implement for all organizations, especially those with resource constraints. And these free webinars that we put on, along with the many templates, guides, and white papers on our resources page of our website, are a great tangible example of how we look to achieve our mission for nonprofits and small to medium businesses around the world. Now, for the next 40 odd minutes, just relax, listen, and add to the discussion by asking, I was just about to say answering, asking as many questions as you would like. A full recording of the webinar along with the slide deck from our presentation today will be sent to you tomorrow. So let me hand over to Fiona and Steven to introduce themselves and then we'll kick off the webinar. Fiona, over to you.
Thank you, Sean. Hello, everybody. I'm dialing in from Sydney today. It's still morning here, and so I'm on the Gadigal lands of the Eora people. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands here and extend that acknowledgement and respect to First Nations people joining us from Aotearoa and any other First Nations joining us today. So let me introduce myself. I'm a negotiation and conflict specialist. I have a background in management consulting, but for the last decade or so, I've been helping leaders and teams use negotiation and positive conflict to boost effectiveness. Sounds weird, but I actually really love conflict. I know our tendency is to avoid it, but it's always on the other side of the conflict where we find the good things and we make progress. In my work, I see that there's always a gap, whether it's a deal that needs negotiating, whether it's some sort of conflict, or if it's just a group of people that aren't on the same page. Alignment, as we'll call it today, and helping people bridge that gap is the work that I do. So I train government and industry in negotiation skills. I help with conflict management. I coach leaders and I facilitate collaborative agreements with boards and leadership teams. I'll hand over to Steven for an introduction.
Thanks, Fiona. Hi, everyone. Steve Bowman from Conscious Governance. I've been working with boards and CEOs and senior executive teams for way too many decades. But one of the things that we really enjoy in the work that we do is sharing with people some of the best ideas from some of the best minds from some of the best organisations around the world. So we do a lot of work with governance reviews, board and governance reviews, with strategic planning, with risk management, a whole range of different things. But what we are able to do is to pull together a whole lot of really, really practical techniques and ways that people have developed up strategies to create better decision making around the board table and share that with you. So we look forward to doing part of that today as well. Back to you, Fiona.
Thank you. Excellent. So the challenge we're talking about today is stakeholder alignment, how to get it, how to keep it, how to do it better. Given my background, I'll be focusing on bringing negotiation skills to the fore, so as a way to align diverse perspectives. And as always, we'll welcome your questions as we go. So when we think about a board, the first stakeholders that come to mind are things like investors and the CEO, but it all depends how you define a stakeholder. I define a stakeholder as anyone who can contribute to, block, or judge your success. So with this definition, stakeholders go beyond the CEO and the shareholders to things like employees, unions, lenders, auditors, regulators, the media, for some organisations, customers, even the wider community. And it's clear that all of these stakeholders will have different priorities. So there's a few on the screen there. Board members want risk reduction and success. Investors want financial returns and sustainability. Employees want job security. Customers want competitive pricing. Regulators want compliance. But here's where it gets tricky. These priorities can often be in conflict. So investors might want higher profits and returns, which means cutting costs like wages. That's obviously not what employees want. Managers might want a positive cash flow, but suppliers want to be paid fast. So there is often a conflict. I will say tentatively, I'm tiptoeing a little bit, but ethics can also play a role in these conflicts. One group of stakeholders might be okay with practices that another group finds morally questionable. The examples that come to mind are decisions that impact vulnerable groups, sometimes things around compliance, anti-competitive behaviour. An example from my own work, it was some time ago working with a business where the CEO was also the chair of a charitable organisation, and there was cultural alignment between the two organisations, but the CEO was pushing for more and more donations from the business to the charity. And strictly speaking, it wasn't unethical, but it made stakeholders really nervous about public perception. And I think in some circles it diminished respect for the charity's mission. Have you got any examples, Stephen, of stakeholder conflict, but maybe somewhere there's an ethical issue?
Yes, look, I think this whole notion of who are stakeholders is probably the very first piece of the puzzle, because to this day still we find that many boards don't actually sit down and list who their key stakeholders are, and often don't even know how to go about doing that. And so one of the best things that a board can spend a little bit of time doing with the senior executive team is actually looking to see what this universe of our key stakeholders are. And Fiona's given a great description of those stakeholders that will either block or support strategic initiatives. The way we look at stakeholders is along similar lines. Our definition of a stakeholder is anyone, any person whose point of view really matters to us, who can actually block or assist in what it is that we're doing. And if you start to look at it through that as the filter, then you start to work out who are the stakeholders, not only for now, but looking at it for 10 years or 20 years into the future. Who are our potential emerging stakeholders that we might want to start to understand their priorities? Your issue of ethics, I think, is a fabulous one, Fiona, because often people don't look at what are some of the ethical issues that actually come along with this. And just to give a little bit of support to that, there are 4 words that I find personally very, very useful in understanding ethical issues. And the 4 words are this: are there any issues of rights, real or imagined? So are we impinging on anyone's rights, either real or imagined, in what we're planning to do with this and with this relationship with our stakeholder? The second one is obligations. Are there any obligations that we're setting up, either real or imagined, where people think that, we're saying this, so therefore they're going to do this? So we're setting up in the minds of others real or imagined obligations. Fairness is the third one. If we're going to do it for this group, what about this group? We're going to do it for this lot of stakeholders. What about this lot of stakeholders? So there has to be an element and understanding the fairness component of it. And then the last one is integrity. So does it pass the sniff test? Does it pass the smell test? Can people see why we're doing this? Is it aligned with our vision? Is it aligned with our values? So, and that notion of looking at ethics through those filters, what we've found, Fiona, is it just really gives, it's like looking at it through a risk filter, but with an ethical filter. So we're starting to look at it from that perspective. And then once you've understood it, you can do something with it. You can leverage it. You can manage it. You can communicate according to whatever you've identified. Fiona, back to you.
Yeah, I like that. I like that frame, Stephen. Rights, obligations, fairness, integrity, they're really good filters. Yeah, someone on the chat has asked to share the definition of a stakeholder again. The definition that I use is anybody that can contribute to, block, or judge your success. There's a question about, I assume that customers also own the social license given to firms that allow them to operate. I'm not quite sure I understand that question. Stephen, can you shed light on that one?
The social license comes about from partially from our constitution, which says, particularly if you're a not-for-profit organisation, but certainly in the corporate sector as well too, is the constitution is the social contract, literally, that you have with your environment. And so therefore, if you have in there the things, here are the things that we should be doing, here are the things we shouldn't be doing, here's how we go about doing it, then actually your constitution is the first part of the social contract. The other part of the social contract primarily is your vision statement. Here is the difference that we want to make. Here is the impact that we want to have. And then actually showing how we're going about doing and aligning with this vision is what creates that social contract, where in the minds of people that this organisation represents this because we see the evidence of it over here. Our job, quite honestly, is to make that easier for our stakeholders to see that linkage between what our vision or our purpose is and the activities that we do. And the role of the board in all of this is to make it overt. So they should be using the vision and purpose statement to actually help shape priorities, to help shape conversations with stakeholders. Sorry, that was a long answer, Fiona.
No, all good. No, that's great. Yeah, I've got another example of, and this is a really good example where actually alignment was really evident. Just in the last month, I've been working with a heavy industry company whose owners have mandated a move to 100% renewables by mid-next decade. And it's a really big ask, and we spent all the key stakeholders. We spent 3 days locked away, nutting out a negotiation strategy. And amazingly, there was a lot of alignment, but it's a real juggle. Depending on how things play out, there'll be massive impacts on environmental targets, on regional employment, on the stability of the power grid. So they're really big stakes. But getting the right stakeholders all together to work on that actually does deliver benefits. So why don't we move on?
We're getting some interesting stuff from Marco. Well done, Marco, for putting your thoughts up there. If you define stakeholders, anyone who can block us, don't you exclude marginalised groups by definition? It's not just anyone who can block us, but anyone who can contribute, anyone who has an impact on, anyone whose points of view really matter to us. And Marco's also gone on and said that you also exclude non-human interest groups since they're not able to block or judge anything. But that doesn't mean the non-human animals, etc., aren't stakeholders. And these are all the questions that you should be asking. There is no one definition that works. Who are our key stakeholders? How do we know? What do we want to achieve with our key stakeholders? How do we know that? How do we measure it? These are all the questions that you could ask.
Oh, that's a really interesting perspective, Marco. I spent a long time working in the meat supply chain world for a little while, so getting meat from abattoirs to supermarkets. And yes, the livestock were big stakeholders in how that happened. And we needed people who were representing, I guess, their rights in that process as well. So there you go. It's very interesting. So I guess the other side of the coin, why do we care about aligning stakeholders? Well, without it, there's a lot more unhealthy conflict. But alignment plays a really crucial role. We get better decisions, we get more ownership of outcomes, risks are easier to spot, because people are more engaged and committed and ready to speak up about them. And, you know, just minor matters like stronger investor confidence and increased employee engagement. And as a board member, your job is to balance all of these competing motivations and concerns. So the first step in doing that is actually to understand where all the different stakeholders stand on the issues. And to do this, you need to map them. So we've got a couple of mapping versions to show you. This first one is, if you Google stakeholder mapping, this is what will come up. And it's looking at influence and impact. And so the bottom left, if there's low influence and low impact, we monitor them. So just give them essential information. Move to the right. We want to keep people informed if it's a high impact on them, but they don't have much influence. The top left, keep them satisfied. And the top right, regular engagement, seeking feedback. This approach works fine, and I have used it myself. It works fine with a project or a single issue. My view is it doesn't actually work for a whole ecosystem of an organisation. I feel like this model is what's the minimum that I have to give them to keep them happy without really involving them. So on the next slide, Sean, if you can pop it up for us. This is a model that I learnt from Harvard's program on negotiation. It's been developed by a fellow called Joel Kucher-Gershenfeld. And instead of looking at how to manage or engage stakeholders, this model looks at the perspectives of different stakeholders within the ecosystem. So it's like a heat map, and every group of stakeholders, there's a vector of every group of stakeholders, and there's a vector of all the interests, so you can look at it from both sides. This image is just representative for a pretty slide, but Sean, if you put one up, I've got here this model. It's just a quick and easy model that is done in Excel. And but you can see there the real heat map. Now, this is actually real data from a client of mine, but I've removed the stakeholders and I've removed the interests. And you can see there, if there's a row with a lot of red means not much alignment. That's a stakeholder to be meeting with and trying to get to the bottom of. If there's a column with a lot of red, that's an interest. That's of concern. Now, I need to say here, for negotiators like me, interests has a particular meaning, and it's used in conjunction with the term position. So positions are what you say you want, and interests are why you want them. And people take positions because they think that's the only way their interests will be met, but often there are other ways. And so we want to look for common ground and approaches that meet the interests of both parties. I'll just share a really quick example, and it's from quite an old book now, but a seminal book in the field of negotiation. It's called Getting to Yes by Roger Fisher and William Ury. And the story goes, there are two sisters fighting over the last orange in the kitchen, and mum comes in and chops the orange in half and gives a half to each daughter. Daughter number one juices the orange and drinks the juice. Daughter number two zests the orange, throws the flesh away and makes a cake. So their positions were they both want the orange. Their interests were quite different. So one was thirsty, one was hungry. So on that chart, the interests are actually the underlying needs or concerns. And my recommendation is that you should be plotting those to really understand where people stand on something. So once you've mapped the stakeholders and their interests, then you're looking for the common ground. Stephen, is there anything you want to throw in there about different ways stakeholders' interests could be mapped?
There's another approach that we've seen some boards use really, really effectively. And I'll take us back a step there. When we're talking about stakeholder engagement, I'm really encouraging boards in particular to look at a longer term time frame than what maybe they've been used to. So rather than doing stakeholder issues just for a particular event coming up or for this year, look at who are the stakeholders currently that we've got, and who are the stakeholders in the next 5 or 10 years that are emerging that we want to start really getting to understand and getting us to the stage where we can actually have really good stakeholder engagement with them in advance of needing to. And where the board becomes into its own on this is where they take that longer term view on stakeholder engagement. There's one wonderful organisation here in Australia called Rural Workforce Agency Victoria. Big shout out to them. And they've created a board committee called Strategic Stakeholder Engagement. And their mandate is to look 10 years to 20 years out ahead to try and work out who are the stakeholders that together we can solve this wicked problem of getting healthcare professionals into rural and remote areas, because we've tried this for 40 years and it hasn't really changed. And so the board has taken this on as, and they've called it a wicked problem. They've taken this on and they've said, we can't do this ourselves. So who can we do this with? And it's not just the traditional, other agencies that we could do. Who are some of these stakeholders? And they've created this real focus on who are these people and organisations that are emerging that we can start to align ourselves with to actually truly address this wicked problem. And what's happened from that is it's changed how they deal with stakeholder engagement. The CEO and the staff team do a fantastic job with the day-to-day and with the annuals and with those where contracts are involved. But the board has taken it on that they actually want to start positioning in advance of needing to, which is actually the very definition of being strategic. So having a look at a longer term timeframe from a board perspective can be very, very powerful. And then when you come back to, well, what do we do with that? We say, well, who are our existing stakeholders? Who are the emerging stakeholders? What do we currently do with them? How is that aligned with our strategy and vision? How do we measure the impact that's having? How else could we do it in ways that we hadn't considered? How do we measure the impact of that? And this then becomes an ongoing review, similar to your strategic plan review, looking at actually strategic stakeholder engagement, but reviewing how we're going about it, whether or not it's making any sort of impact, how else we could go about it, and who else we could do it with. So different sort of way of looking at it, the same sort of issues.
Yeah, no, I really like that, Stephen. And I think with the definition that we've got, well, that I'm using about contribute to, block or judge, and I really like that view of looking to the future and who can contribute to, block or judge in the future is yeah, I think that throws so much more light and interest on who the stakeholders are that we need to look at. There's a couple of questions there. How do you best achieve alignment between parent organisations and subsidiaries? That's an age-old question, isn't it? I think from a negotiation perspective, sharing data and information is always the best approach. And we will talk a little bit about this in the sort of coming slides. Did you want to throw any light on that, Stephen?
I think looking at subsidiaries and looking at parent companies and so on, one of the things that often gets lost is the strategy and purpose of the parent company should actually help inform the strategy and purpose of the subsidiary. And often the issues, we've got one at the moment where the same directors from the parent company sit on the subsidiary company, which is problematic because what happens is you essentially have two meetings talking about slightly different things with a slightly different variation to it. And so moving away to having more independent people sitting on the subsidiary rather than just having the same directors sit on there. The key thing is the alignment of the vision and the purpose, but then what is the purpose of the subsidiary that actually supports also what the parent company is doing? And it's an ongoing conversation. Fiona?
Yes, the heavy industry example that I mentioned earlier, we, in that session, developing the negotiation strategy, for the move to renewables, we actually had representatives of the parent company in the room, which meant everybody was hearing the same presentations and involved in the same development of the strategy. So it is all about opening those channels of communication and giving everybody opportunities to contribute. There's a question: does keep satisfied risk shadow directorship? I guess it could. I guess it could.
I mean, the issue with shadow directorship, for those that aren't familiar with it, is the law very clearly says in almost every jurisdiction that if you look like, act like, and are treated like a director, it doesn't matter what you're called, then you are deemed to be a director. So shadow directors are those who are used to being listened to. And the issue then is if you start making decisions for that one particular person, then that could raise the issue of shadow directorship. I think this is much, much broader than this. This is a stakeholder. So when you're looking at a particular stakeholder, again, you look at keeping them satisfied, but keeping them satisfied is actually more about discussing the purpose of the organisation, discussing its values, keeping them aligned with what those things are. And if they're totally dissatisfied with that, then that's a different conversation. That then comes into your space, Fiona, where there might be disputes between what a particular shareholder or even some members. If you're a member organisation and you've got 2 or 3 really large members and you can't afford to lose one of the large members, and they tend to then start to dictate to you what it is that the organisation should be doing, you've got a problem. And that's probably where the negotiation comes in. Fiona, your thoughts?
Yeah, look, absolutely. I think, well, I think negotiation's the answer to most problems in the world. Having people, be able to discuss and decide a way forward where there's mutual agreement is a very strong way to solve most problems. So we probably should move on. I'm just watching the time. And so an important concept for negotiating interests is the myth of the fixed pie. Now, I don't know how many people have heard that term, the fixed pie, expand the pie. It's a common misconception in negotiation. It's where people believe that resources or opportunities are finite and they've got to be divided like a pie. And it can lead to zero-sum thinking or the zero-sum mentality, which is the assumption that a negotiation is always competitive, where a gain for one side is a loss for another. In the vernacular, the more pie you get, the less is left for me. And if people believe in the myth of the fixed pie, there's usually more conflict because people are seeing everything in terms of winning and losing. Now, there are some negotiations where this is the case. Buying a car is a classic zero-sum game. Every extra dollar I save is a dollar less in the seller's pocket. Here's the surprise, though. In most negotiations, it is possible for the pie to be expanded. So the first step is actually to understand what people's interests are. So the mapping tools that we've already touched on play a role. And once you've done those, they need to be shared widely with the organisation. Believing that there will be winners and losers creates winners and losers. So if you allow stakeholders to believe the pie is limited, they're going to be looking to shore up the biggest piece of the pie for themselves. So as leaders, you want to be helping people look past that zero-sum game. We don't want people digging their heels in on rigid positions. You want to be looking for solutions that benefit both sides. And we do that by building trust and creative problem solving. And the ultimate goal is to leave everybody better off than they would have been in a competitive, distributive negotiation. Now, I'm sure you're all desperate for an example now after I've just done that big description. My best example from my work was I was working with a regional university who needed to renegotiate their catering contract for all of their on-campus colleges. So they were feeding thousands of students, they are feeding thousands of students every day. Because it's a regional town, it couldn't go to tender. There had to be a direct negotiation with the incumbent provider. and the university subsidises the students' meals. So the students were paying for breakfast, lunch and dinner 7 days a week, 21 meals a week, and the university was subsidising that. Once we actually got past people's positions and looked at their interests, we discovered that the students didn't want to be locked into 21 meals a week. Most of them were out on Friday nights. Lots of them didn't want to come back to college for lunch. They stayed on campus. Lots of students slept through breakfast. Obviously, the university wanted to reduce its subsidy, but this was the interesting thing that we didn't expect. For the supplier, the biggest issue was actually food wastage, not revenue. So by structuring different meal plans for students, the students got what they want, because if they didn't want to pay for weekend meals, they didn't need to. If they didn't want to pay for lunch, they didn't need to. The provider was able to, their revenue actually reduced, but their profit really shot through the roof because they didn't have food wastage, because they had surety of who would be there. And as a result, the university paid a lower subsidy. So this is an example of not assuming the pie is fixed. So everyone's kind of share of the deal was the same, but the pie got much bigger. The benefits to everybody got bigger. So that's an example where the stakeholders were engaged. We really got to understand what their interests were. And we were able to, with that alignment, then structure an arrangement where everybody was better off. Stephen, do you have any examples of that?
Yeah, I've got a great example also. Many of you, if not already, will probably be into the future, be looking at possible mergers or possible acquisitions or possible coming together, whatever term you want to use it. But one of the best examples of this myth of the fixed pie and how to change it was we were involved in assisting with three organisations that wanted to potentially merge. And one of the things that we did was actually develop up a strategic planning session for the new merged entity if it were to occur. And so this is in advance of actually merging. So what we did is we got the three boards and the three senior executives together, and we developed up a vision for the potential new merged entity. So that was understanding the stakeholders' interests. We then looked at, well, what would be the 3 or 4 key strategies for the first 3 years? So that grew both the knowledge of each of the individual organisations and their boards, but also a bit of a blueprint of, what would we do in the first 100 days? What would we do in the first 3 years of what we're doing? So that looks at the looking past zero-sum thinking and avoiding rigid positions. And from there, we developed up the actions going forward over the next 3 years with the thinking and the template that even if this didn't occur as a merger, these things would still make sense for us to do as individual organisations. Now, as a direct result of that, all of a sudden trust was formed because there was a shared vision and purpose. And each of the directors then got to know all the other directors, and the senior execs got to know each other a little bit better. They had a shared purpose in what they were doing. They had a clear, these are the 3 things over the next 3 years that this merged entity, if it were to occur, were to go ahead. Here are the action plans that we would go through. Here's the timeframes around them and the outcome measures that would make a difference. Each of the boards went back separately and they said, this just makes so much sense. And what happened then was that both the shared purpose statement and the strategies formed the communication that they then had with their members to approve the merger. And it was one of the most powerful exercises that we'd seen, where they could see the value coming through. It wasn't just talking about it, it was an actual plan in advance of. And even if we didn't merge, elements of this plan still made sense for the individual organisations. So I thought that was a really clever way that they'd gone through in terms of actually having a look at stakeholder engagement, but through the lens of potential merger, that even if the merger didn't go ahead, this whole process had immense value to each of the three organisations. Fiona.
Oh, I love that. I think that's a really great example, Stephen. And I think I've been involved in a similar one where an aged care provider bought a rehab hospital, and there were similar outcomes there where the synergies were so real, but the work to work out what that merger would look like brought benefits of its own right. So, yeah, fantastic. We've got a few more questions there. Lillian's asked for the ecosystem approach heat map examples of what interests are. So I think I'm hoping that we've covered that, Lillian, but the interests should have come through in the example, but they're things like for an employee, an interest might be salary. Sorry, a position might be salary, but an interest might be something like opportunities or development. So that might be helpful. Dom has asked, any thoughts with collaborations and consultations with First Nations people as partners as opposed to stakeholders? I don't have any personal examples of that, Dom. I don't know whether you do, Stephen.
Well, partners as stakeholders, stakeholders as partners, to me, essentially, they should be one and the same thing. So a partner has more of a legal connotation to it in that we share both the risks and the rewards that come out of this, and we've got very clear memorandum of understandings of how we go about doing it. You can always turn anyone into a partner by literally developing up a memorandum of understanding of how we're going to work in these areas. And they may not be contract related, but we've certainly seen that with many organisations where they set up, here's our expectations of how we work together on these things. Stakeholders in many people's minds is a very passive concept. And I think what Fiona and I are saying is that this should become much more active, much more overt. So let's understand, work with, not just doing a desk audit of them. Let's actually, I don't know, do something strange like have conversations with them and actually sit down with them and work out what are our interests, what are their interests, how can we develop this together, what can we do together that we can't do individually. Who else could we be doing this with? How can we expand out our stakeholders in this area? What are the risks of us doing this? What are the risks they see of us doing this? How can we then expand that out and look at stakeholder engagement to mitigate and leverage some of those risks? So it becomes that ongoing conversation rather than just a piece of paper or some sort of plan. I find that what many organisations don't do is that they don't overtly develop stakeholder engagement. It sort of happens by happenstance. Who are our stakeholders? These ones. Why are they stakeholders? Oh, it happened. And I think what Fiona and I are saying in all of this is if we take a more strategic viewpoint on this, have those communications, put a little bit of rigour behind it, monitor it, figure out which parts of these are the things that are going to really make a difference and how are we going to measure that, and then check in with our stakeholders that we're in alignment with it. That's a very different engagement than just having a stakeholder engagement map.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, I agree. There's an organisation in Australia called Many Rivers that works with a lot of First Nations groups. So it's basically a microfinancing group where they help micro businesses get a start. Maybe they'll, buy a piece of equipment to make something. It's very impressive, and their view is very similar to what Stephen was just talking about. So really engaging with stakeholders. They've got teams that are working in local communities with micro businesses and providing all of the support until they're ready to be standing on their own 2 feet. But that work is all about working side by side and working in that engagement sense. So it's a great example.
Just for people's interest, if you haven't already read it, maybe have a look up, do a Google search on Grameen Bank and Muhammad Yunus, who has, so he created this whole notion of stakeholder engagement by a bank with villages in, I think it was India and or Pakistan, it could have been. And I think I saw on the news the other day, he has just been made the new president of Pakistan. Forgive me if I get the names of the countries wrong, but have a look at Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank, and that'll give you an understanding, a real understanding of how stakeholder engagement can be more than just a piece of paper, how you can actually understand how the small things that we can do together as stakeholders can create huge impact on the world, which is, after all, why we have our businesses. Fiona.
Thank you. There's still a couple of questions in there. There's one I can answer quickly, which is the heat map model. It comes from Joel Kucher-Gershenfeld. But just watching time, we'll just whiz through this last slide here. So sometimes a win-win isn't possible across all of the interests of all of the stakeholders, even though that's the gold standard and what we're aiming for. And when that's the case, you need to be negotiating a trade-off. Sometimes trade-offs with a clear justification can be negotiated. An investor might accept a short-term profit if it leads to long-term growth. But when it's not possible, it's all about balance. And that means for the right outcome, someone's got to give something up that matters to them. So balancing act means carefully weighing benefits and drawbacks of different options. You want to make sure that stakeholders feel their concerns have been listened to, even if they can't be addressed. Now, a cautionary tale, I've seen this done really well, but I've also seen it done really appallingly. I worked on a deal once where there was two business partners that had been in business a very long time, and they were negotiating a separation because one of them was retiring. The partner retiring wanted a decent reflection, a decent share payout of his contribution to the business over his time, and the remaining partner didn't want to do that. His concern was when the senior partner left that the business would falter. So I was engaged to help them agree terms and we worked really hard on looking at expanding that pie, but in the end the junior partner dragged out an old contract that framed up the maximum payout that was possible, and the senior partner didn't really get what he deserved. So sometimes, for all our best intentions, we are not able to pull that win-win expanded pie deal together, and that's when you'd really need to be looking to that balancing act. And the final thing really there is stories help us make sense of the world. They help make concepts stick. I reckon you'll remember my story about the university or the oranges longer than you'll remember any of the theory that we've touched on. So when you're dealing with your stakeholders, remember that stories are embedded in their brains differently. So find ways to craft narratives that speak to diverse stakeholders in a way that they will rally behind. Stephen, have you got any comments on that?
I'm just looking at a great question that was asked in there. Is there such a thing as stakeholder bias? How do you manage your bias or perceptions of a stakeholder? That's a fantastic question. And this really has to be something that the board takes on. The issue there is that what about those stakeholders that we find really difficult? Do we still deal with them as stakeholders? What about the stakeholders we don't even know about? What about those where everyone has said, this is just too hard? Do we just not do them and we focus on the low-hanging fruit? These are all the questions that really the board need to look at, and through that also the senior executives. Are we dealing with those that we should be dealing with that are actually going to create a bigger difference? And how can we deal with them differently than what we've done in the past? Because doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result is just straight out insane. Yeah. So I think that was a great question. Thank you for that. And I think the board should be asking those questions constantly. Even the very question, have we got a bias here? What about those we haven't thought about? What about those that we deem as too hard or too difficult? What if we could reframe that in a way that would enable us to have a different engagement with them in a way that would create greater impact? So back to you, Fiona.
Yeah, look, I agree with that. I think, and in my work in negotiation, good negotiators are really aware of their own biases and they try and frame those before they even get into the room. So it's exactly the same for boards. Directors should be aware of their biases and they should be working to bring those things that are deep inside themselves to light, so that they can view the world from the perspectives of other people. We're at time now. That's contact information for Steven and for me. The QR code there is to my newsletter if you're interested. I write every 2 or 3 weeks. It's only about a 2-minute read. I work hard to keep things down to about 400 words. Thanks for being with us today. Over to you, Sean.
Thanks, Fiona. Thanks, Stephen. So you'll receive an email from us. It'll be later on this afternoon, which will include a copy of the webinar video and also the template that Fiona has kindly shared with us, the Excel template. So as you leave the webinar, don't forget to complete our 1-minute survey and go in the draw for our hamper. We will announce the winner this afternoon as well on that email. So thank you for your attendance, everybody. I hope you enjoyed the session. Thanks, Fiona and Stephen, for your contribution. We look forward to seeing you all at our next webinar, everybody. Have a great day.